The Scrum Guide, the definitive guide to Scrum, the rules of the game, developed and sustained by Scrum creators Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. Part 5. Monitoring progress towards goals. At any point in time, the total work remaining to reach a goal can be summed. The product owner tracks this total work remaining at least every sprint review. The product owner compares this amount with work remaining at previous sprint reviews to assess progress towards completing projected work by the desired time for the goal. This information is made transparent to all stakeholders. Various projective practices upon trending have been used to forecast progress, like burn downs, burn ups, or cumulative flows. These have proven useful. However, these do not replace the importance of empiricism. In complex environments, what will happen is unknown. Only what has already happened may be used for forward-looking decision-making. Sprint backlog. The sprint backlog is the set of product backlog items selected for the sprint, plus a plan for delivering the product increments and realizing the sprint goal. The sprint backlog is a forecast by the development team about what functionality will be in the next increment and the work needed to deliver that functionality into a done increment. The sprint backlog makes visible all the work that the development team identifies as necessary to meet the sprint goal. To ensure continuous improvement, it includes at least one high priority process improvement identified in the previous retrospective meeting. The sprint backlog is a plan with enough detail that changes in progress can be understood in the daily Scrum. The development team modifies the sprint backlog throughout the sprint, and the sprint backlog emerges during the sprint. This emergence occurs as the development team works through the plan and learns more about the work needed to achieve the sprint goal. As new work is required, the development team adds it to the sprint backlog. As work is performed or completed, the estimated remaining work is updated. When elements of the plan are deemed unnecessary, they are removed. Only the development team can change its sprint backlog during a sprint. The sprint backlog is a highly visible, real-time picture of the work that the development team plans to accomplish during the sprint, and it belongs solely to the development team. Monitoring sprint progress. At any point in time in a sprint, the total work remaining in the sprint backlog can be summed. The development team tracks this total work remaining at least for every daily Scrum to project the likelihood of achieving the sprint goal. By tracking the remaining work throughout the sprint, the development team can manage its progress. Increment. The increment is the sum of all the product backlog items completed during a sprint and the value of the increments of all previous sprints. At the end of a sprint, the new increment must be done, which means it must be in usable condition and meet the Scrum team's definition of done. An increment is a body of inspectable, done work that supports empiricism. At the end of the sprint, the increment is a step towards a vision or goal. The increment must be in usable condition regardless of whether the product owner decides to release it. Artifact transparency. Scrum relies on transparency. Decisions to optimize value and control risk are made based on the perceived state of the artifacts. To the extent that the transparency is complete, these decisions have a sound basis. To the extent that the artifacts are incompletely transparent, these decisions can be flawed, value may diminish, and risk may increase. The Scrum Master must work with the product owner, development team, and other involved parties to understand if the artifacts are completely transparent. There are practices for coping with incomplete transparency. The Scrum Master must help everyone apply the most appropriate practices in the absence of complete transparency. A Scrum Master can detect incomplete transparency by inspecting the artifacts, sensing patterns, listening closely to what is being said, and detecting differences between expected and real results. The Scrum Master's job is to work with the Scrum team and the organization to increase the transparency of the artifacts. This work usually involves learning, convincing, and change. Transparency doesn't occur overnight, but it is a path. Definition of done. When a product backlog item or an increment is described as done, everyone must understand what done means. Although this may vary significantly per Scrum team, members must have a shared understanding of what it means for work to be complete to ensure transparency. This is the definition of done for the Scrum team and is used to assess when work is complete on the product increment. The same definition guides the development team in knowing how many product backlog items it can select during a sprint planning. The purpose of each sprint is to deliver increments of potentially releasable functionality that adhere to the Scrum team's current definition of done. Still on the definition of done, development teams deliver an increment of product functionality every sprint. This increment is usable, so a product owner may choose to immediately release it. If the definition of done for an increment is part of the conventions, standards, or guidelines of the development organization, all Scrum teams must follow it as a minimum. If done for an increment is not a convention of the development organization, the development team of the Scrum team must define a definition of done appropriate for the product. If there are multiple Scrum teams working on the system or product release, the development teams on all the Scrum teams must mutually define the definition of done. Each increment is additive to all prior increments and thoroughly tested, ensuring that all increments work together. As Scrum teams mature, it is expected that their definitions of done will expand to include more stringent criteria for higher quality. New definitions, as used, may uncover work to be done in previously done increments. Any one product or system should have a definition of done that is a standard for any work done on it. Endnote: Scrum is free and offered in this guide. Scrum's roles, events, artifacts, and rules are immutable, and although implementing only parts of Scrum is possible, the result is not Scrum. Scrum exists only in its entirety and functions well as a container for other techniques, methodologies, and practices. Now we'll move to acknowledgements. And that concludes our review of the Scrum Guide in Part 5, developed and sustained by the Scrum creators Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your knowledge, wisdom, and expertise.